we kind of skipped Dan this morning because we ran out of time. So Dan's going to talk a little bit about cave designation as special cave. No, what's the right word? Significant cave. So.
Hey everybody, thanks for the opportunity to talk today. For those of you that I don't know, I'm Dan Siefert with the Forest Service. I am the Region 1 Cave and Karst Coordinator. We have also got some other Forest Service folks here. Deanna Stever is the National Cave and Karst Coordinator for the Forest Service. So I guess the first thing to say is like, welcome to your national forest. The Helena, Lewis, and Clark, here we are. We've got David Peterson back here. He's the Deputy District Ranger at the Belt District. Who else do we have in the Forest Service audience running around? I think Amy Shovelin and Jamie were running around. So if you want to talk Forest Service stuff or land management with any of us this weekend, feel free to pull us aside and we're here to listen. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the Forest Service Cave and Karst program, and if the PowerPoint doesn't work, I'll wing it. All right.
We're good.
Okay.
Okay.
So go ahead and click to the next slide. So here's kind of what we're going to talk about today is just what is the Forest Service Cave and Karst program? Why do we manage cave resources? Where are the caves? Some of the cave resource management conservation things that we are working on, and then how do we do it? And the real main thing I wanted to emphasize was the cave significance nomination process. So Forest Service is part of USDA. And then we've got the Minerals and Geology group within USDA, and that's what Deanna is part of. And then the National Cave and Karst program. And then each individual forest has also got cave and karst coordinators. We've got a number of regions of the Forest Service scattered across the country. Each region has got a coordinator as well. So I'm the coordinator for Region 1. That includes Montana, North Idaho, and parts of the Dakotas. So why do we manage cave and karst resources? Probably the biggest thing is because that's what the law tells us to do. We've got a number of laws, regulations, and policy. I'm sure everybody loves all this bureaucratic stuff, but really what's driving us to do it is the Federal Cave Resource Protection Act of 1988. So that's basically the law that Congress wrote that sets things up to tell government land management agencies that we ought to be taking care of caves and conserving cave resources. A big part of that is getting caves designated as significant under that act. Am I missing anything, Deanna? Do you want to?
Yeah, so if we don't get them designated significant, we can't protect anything in the cave or manage the caves. So, but any of you guys can nominate a cave that you want or come and check and see if it is already designated significant. And then we can take steps after that to get it nominated or get it signed off and protected.
So does that mean that if it isn't designated significant, you can't even put a gate on it?
No, you can't.
You can, but then no other management can happen until it's designated significant?
The significance designation basically gives it a higher level of conservation status, so we need to pay more attention to the specific resources within the cave.
Gotcha. Okay.
And once it's designated, then you can go back and apply that law to it.
So yeah, some of the stuff that came out of that federal law is basically caves are invaluable and irreplaceable, and they're threatened from a variety of sources. So one of the big things is improper use. We saw some of that at Lick Creek Cave yesterday. Found a nice stalactite sled in there. Increased recreation use. Urban spread. That may not be a concern in Montana, but it is in other parts of the country. And just lack of specific protection. And these are all the things that were in that law. So the law basically set up planning and public participation requirement, basically. So again, we're supposed to make sure that we think about significant caves when we do land management activities, and we're also told to work with groups such as the Northern Rocky Mountain Grotto and the NSS to better manage caves and take care of cave resources. So one of the things a lot of folks don't realize is I've had a seasonal crew working for me for a couple years, and they came up with a great term called the federal cave, what the Federal Cave Resource Protection Act says is if a person can go in it, it's a cave. So a lot of states will set their own kind of lengths for what's really a cave, but under that law, if you can fit inside of it, it's officially a cave. So there's a government cave in the Pryor Mountains. So we also have some regulations that tell us how to implement that law within the Forest Service. So there are some nomination criteria under our regulations. One of the big things is biota. So we're really focused on bats these days because of white nose syndrome, really damaging those populations in other parts of the country. There's also cultural resources, so rock art, graffiti older than 50 years, that's a cultural resource. Geologic features, so a lot of the flow stones, stalactites, stalagmites. Hydrology, there are a lot of places that rely on karst systems to supply groundwater and surface water. And recreational use, that's another value of caves. And then education, scientific purposes. So a lot of caves provide pristine locations to do scientific studies such as climate monitoring, identification of rare and endangered species. So basically, under that law, if you have any one of those things present, you can designate a cave as significant. Here's a map that shows where all the caves and karsts are on the national forests. So we're way up there in Montana, got a big red zone right around Lick Creek Cave. Yeah, so we've got caves and karsts scattered all over the country, and each location's got different resource values and things that we need to focus on as far as conservation management. Here's a list from our internal database as far as like what we have official information on. And I think I once heard an estimate that only about half the caves might be in that database.
I bet it's less than that.
Yeah, less than that maybe. So that's part of it, is like as land managers, we don't even have our act together in terms of knowing how many caves we have or where they are. And so that's where I think groups like the Grotto really come in and are able to, help us get there essentially. So I just thought this was kind of neat. Here's a list of some of the deeper and longer caves that are on the national forest across the United States. I think the biggest one is, or the longest one is Jewel Cave. They just hit 200 miles a little while ago, and it's still growing. So yeah, that's one of the longer caves in the National Forest System, not too far from here.
The Cheers is over 1,800 feet deep.
See, outdated information. That's why you guys need to share with us.
You should put at least on there.
Yeah, and growing, right? So part of the other thing is not only do we want to know where the caves are, but we want to be able to kind of direct some of the land management activities that the Forest Service is doing and try and set them up so we aren't doing activities that actually damage caves or cave resources. So I think I have a list of various activities. We've got things like grazing, sewage discharge, timber cutting, oil and gas, mining, all those things can damage cave resources. And so for the Forest Service and other federal land management agencies, we want to know where the caves are and what the resources are within those caves so we can avoid causing problems when we go do other land management activities on the surface. So yeah, how do we manage caves? How do we conserve cave resources? We work with a whole lot of other people. So there's a big list of some of the entities that we work with. We've got folks from the state here today. I think that's great. I think we have a pretty good cooperative relationship with you all in terms of managing some of the species that are in caves. We also work with the cave groups. So yeah, that's why I'm here. So how can you guys help us? Get involved. So any of those land management activities that the Forest Service is doing, we generally have public comment and involvement requirements. So, cave management plans, Project NEPA, forest plan revision. We could change some of the laws and policies. It's your land. Step in and get involved, let your voice be heard, and we'll try to listen and respond accordingly. You can volunteer, you can share information and data with your local forest. You can nominate significant caves. And join the Grotto. Or get a job. Just to put a plug in, we are hiring a cave resource inventory crew for the Pryor Mountains next summer. If any of you are interested, hit me up. So these are the worksheets that need to get filled out. If you have a cave that hasn't yet been designated as significant, we can work with you to fill one of these sheets out. You know, it's kind of getting at those Cave Resource Protection Act criteria that we talked about. So we've got cultural resources, geologic resources, hydrologic. I think there's a couple more pages of the form. But basically anybody can fill one of these forms out, submit it, and the local forest supervisor needs to consider it as a nomination and figure out whether or not to designate it. So yeah, that's what I have for you today. Do you have anything else to add, Deanna? Okay, any questions?
How many caves are designated now as significant?
I think the numbers are in that list. I don't know off the top of my head. Yeah.
It looked like around 21 or 2200.
Yeah, it's buried way back in the PowerPoint. And again, some of that data may not be the entire picture. There you go.
23.
Yeah, 2,300 out of the 3,900 that we've gotten in our database, and I'm sure there are considerably more than that.
Those are all then considered significant.
Yep. Any other questions? Okay, well, thanks everybody for the opportunity.
Then I'll just click this on.
You want both of them?
This includes my camera.
Oh,
You can throw that in the pocket.
I can. Thank you, Will. Okay, is that one working? Yeah. All right, I'm Lauri, Hanauska-Brown. You guys have to listen to this talk again, but it's just an update on white nose syndrome. So I'm the non-game bureau chief out of the Helena Office of Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. So I run the state program on our side for managing bats and surveillance and management of white nose syndrome. And then Bryce is here, Bryce Maxwell, and he's with the Heritage Program. He's in charge of that program now as the executive director or something. Dan Bachen, many of you know, is the senior zoologist. Dan and Danielle had a baby 3 weeks ago. So he was hoping to make it here today, but apparently last night they maybe didn't have such a great night. So Bryce and I are going to try to tag time Dan's presentation right after this, but I'm just going to make this pretty quick. You can go ahead, Cody Rose. This is the current map, okay? So we've been looking at this map now for 3 years at this meeting, but for longer than that at the spring grotto meeting at Lewis and Clark Caverns. I don't know what they're gonna do with color scheme right now because they started out as this kind of blue and purple, then it went turquoise green, yellow and red. I don't know what they're gonna do once it actually hits Montana, but the colors just represent the time at which either the fungus, so the fungus is Pseudogymnoasca, oh my gosh, I'm drawing a blank. It's PD. It's the fungus that actually causes white nose syndrome. So we kind of mix the things up when we talk about them. So either PD or actually the disease in a bat was detected as these colors go across. So in 2015 was that weird year where the disease jumped 1,300 miles. I think at that time it was around Oklahoma and it jumped all the way to Washington State. That hasn't necessarily been solved as to how it got there, but since that time, they've picked up white nose syndrome positive bats every year since. So it's clearly in Washington. It wasn't one sort of, incidental one-time event. But over the last few years, it's been picked up in South Dakota, Wyoming, there was a North Dakota. So everybody kind of has that history, go back, Cody Rose, as it's been moving across. California detection this past year, some of these detections are what they call equivocal, so it means it's probably PD or probably white nose syndrome, but regardless, it's moving across. I really thought we'd find it last winter, and we didn't. We did sample at 4 caves and 1 set of bat boxes last year, got our minimum samples, and we can do that either by swabbing the nose of the bats themselves or through soil samples. And in some cases now they're saying that spring guano collection is an okay way to sample as well because the bats groom the fungus off and then it shows itself genetically in the guano. So really surprised we didn't get it last year. We have plans to sample again this next year, and you can go ahead. These are the bats that are using our caves and mines, so that you guys have seen this one again. And then the letters after the species name just indicate whether they're susceptible to white nose syndrome or PD. So we have a fair number of bats that might carry the fungus from place to place but aren't actually impacted by the disease. And then there's bats that kind of do both. And this is from a lot of the work back east in terms of what they've seen as far as species infection. And then as it moves west, there's kind of new species that get added every year because they maybe aren't eastern species or Midwest species, but they show up positive in a place like South Dakota or Texas, and then we have to add to our list of potentially impacted bats. These are our hibernacula. Everybody has seen this. This is what we've put together in large part from the caving community helping us out. And since their original kind of identification of where they knew bats were, then some post monitoring of those places so that we kind of know currently what we have across the landscape. If you compare this to caves back east, it would be significantly different. They have caves that have tens of thousands of bats. Our largest hibernacula that we're aware of is that Azure Cave up there in north central Montana. And then there's a bunch down here in the Pryor Mountains, and then Lick Creek and the central Montana caves are represented. Just as a point of reference, in order to say that the disease or the fungus is not in a particular hibernacula, the National Wildlife Health Center requires that you sample at least 25 bats or some number of bats plus some amount of soil to sample. And for us, that's a challenge in different places. So we might be able to swab 10 bats, but then we have to fill the rest of those vials with soil, which is a less ideal sample to test. But in a lot of places, it's the best we can get, either because there's only 10 bats there, or there's 10 bats we can get our hands on and the others are out of reach. Okay, so this next, you can go ahead, Cody. So plans for 2020, there's a couple different ways we can do this, right? This is the hard way. This was a group of folks in Lick Creek Cave. This winter we went in there and not only sampled, but for those of you that saw the Great Falls Tribune, we had Carl Puckett, who's the reporter up there. He came along, he brought a photographer who had a whole bunch of gear. And Zach went along with us, and then we also had a researcher from South Carolina or North Carolina along. It was a huge hike. It was an epically long day with a lot of different objectives being met. And then the bottom picture again just shows kind of what the winter hibernacula work looks like. It's often difficult with lots of hiking across snow and then getting into the caves themselves. And hit the next one. Or we can do it this way. So I went and trapped at these bat boxes in May in northwest Montana because we lost access to one of our caves up there this winter just because of a permitting snafu that was my fault as much as anybody's. But we wanted to make sure we got samples from northwest Montana in case, you know, our first detection was from maybe bats in Washington. So this is Louis Young's house in Libby. He had 600 bats in these houses at the time that I went up there to sample. And what they're finding is that you can actually detect the fungus a lot later into the year than what they thought. So originally when you collected samples, you really had to do it, you know, January, February, March, maybe into April, because as the bats come out, they're grooming off the fungus if they have it. And the health lab is saying, actually, we're picking up on bats all the way through June. So this is a really perfect storm for us when we have bats that occupy these houses early that could still be carrying the fungus. And I tell you what, this was way easier than that last madness. So click again, Cody Rose. I mean, we were in bed by 10:30. We were clean. I had a glass of wine. I mean, it was just fabulous. So we're looking for more of these kind of sites to sample because we're going to actually try to increase the number of places we sample this coming spring based on some direction from the health center. And as you can imagine, what the disease ecologists are trying to do is track kind of the leading edge of this disease. And so what that means is there's a big spotlight or a big target on Montana right now because we're assumed to be the next ones to show up positive. So they want us to collect lots and lots of samples. But when they say we need you to go to 30 hibernacula and collect samples from 25 bats, I laugh at them because it's really not very doable. So we're going to combine some sampling effort and do more of this bat box work if we can find bat boxes that are occupied early in the spring, as well as wrap that in with some hibernacula, and then maybe some pooled guano collection, because the health lab doesn't really like it, but they recognize the reality of some of these western states, and they say if you can collect guano again early, so the minute the bats get to a bridge and start piling in there in any number, you can collect guano over a month-long period and then submit that for testing, and again, the fungus should show itself in the guano samples. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I put this together really fast yesterday. If anybody has questions about white nose syndrome, we can talk about it, but that's kind of the basics. Nope. Stand by, Cody Rose. Any questions on white nose? Yes. Okay, yes.
When it shows up in the area, how long does it take to wipe out that?
Well, that's a good question. So what they found in the eastern states is the first year they pick up PD, it's often 1 or 2 years before they actually see much die off with the bats. So it takes a little bit of time to build up. Again, western state situations are not going to necessarily be the same as eastern states, so it's all kind of a guess as to how the disease might actually impact our populations. Keeping in mind too that we have much, much smaller populations in these caves. So if it hits azure, which is full of myotis bats, so we're kind of assuming we'll see it there, it could take out a fair number, but if it hits Lick Cave on the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribe lands, it might take out 40 bats, because that's really all that's in there. So it's going to be, we're not sure what's going to happen, but we have lots of plans to continue monitoring and whatnot. And again, the Health Center for Madison is very heavy into helping us figure out what we should be doing to detect the disease. Response, we have a response plan, I guess I should mention that, that's been put together with the agencies that are in the room, as well as Zach and Ian often represent the Grotto in those discussions. Our response right now is to kind of do more of what we've been doing, which is to prevent human spread of the fungus as much as possible, so decontamination, education on just the importance of bats, because one of the things we want to make sure is if white nose syndrome starts wiping out our bats, that we are doing everything else we can to protect the little buggers in other situations. So reducing human caused mortality in houses or barns, or maybe bridge construction by Department of Transportation could be modified so that there's less impact on bats. So we don't have a great response plan like we're going to go out and start spraying anti-fungicide all over the place. We're going to kind of track the newest methods of controlling the fungus, but we're going to work real hard to just conserve the bats we have. Yes?
In the previous slide, you showed what bats can contract white nose syndrome and what bats can't. The ones with the question mark next to them, was it saying that you guys haven't tested those bats yet, or you guys weren't sure?
Go back, Cody. Oh, you have. Okay. Bryce can help me out here. I think these probably just are bats that haven't necessarily been exposed to the fungus because of their range. So they're western species that maybe haven't had a chance to show whether they're going to be impacted by the disease or not. It's a good question.
The Yuma actually now has been tested as positive, so it's likely all the ones with the question marks will test positive. They just haven't yet.
Yes.
How did it make the jump from?
Yeah, from the Midwest to Washington. So there was a whole bunch of speculation as to how it made that jump in 2015, and I remember talking about it at this meeting and other meetings. People were saying it was a bat that had the fungus that got on a train, or maybe it got rolled up in somebody's RV umbrella and it got deposited in Washington. That probably would have been a likely explanation if there would have just been that one detection, but it does appear that with the other detections in recent years that it either got there somehow, maybe like that, and it started to spread itself around, or maybe a bat or a number of bats came in through Canada. We don't really know, and I don't think we will know, other than the one thing they confirmed is that the genetic makeup of the fungus on the bat found in Washington was the same genetic makeup of the fungus in the eastern United States, because there was some speculation when this first happened that maybe it came from a bat, across the Pacific Ocean or something. But it is the same fungus, at least in other places.
Can I add to that?
Yeah. So, Daryl's from Washington. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm Daryl Greaser. I'm the chair of the Grotto in Seattle, where we have white nose, or we have PD everywhere. The legend was, of course, there's a shipyard in Seattle that came on a ship or a train. But what they found out was they did genetic testing on the bats. The bats are local bats. So the genetic makeup of all the bats they found that they've tested so far are similar to the indigenous bats in that area. So far we don't have any evidence that it was an actual bat that came there, and of course this just widens the mystery and why. And I thought there was 3 counties, and I see 4 there now. Why there's 4 counties? None of the bats in Washington have been found in caves. They've all been found in the forest, and the first one that was found was in the middle of a hiking trail, not too far from some of the caves. But anyway, who knows?
No, that's really good. And some of those new counties just popped up this summer.
Yeah,
so,
the easternmost one just popped.
Yep. Okay, you can go on to the caving and climbing slide. So I just wanted to mention, oh, we got another question. Finn.
Why is there no of that stuff in the ocean?
Oh, why is there none of the fungus in the ocean? That one's going to go to Bryce Maxwell. I don't know. It's a good question.
It wouldn't survive in the ocean. This fungus only lives in cold soils or on bats. And one other note about the cold fungus, most of our caves appears on the colder end and a little bit too cold for the fungus. So that bodes well for bats, at least our cave bats. And one other note since I'm talking, and that is that our caves don't seem to be all that important relative to caves in the east in terms of hundreds of thousands of bats roosting in those caves. But we have things like our talus slopes and our rock outcrops that appear to be much more important in the west. But again, that might bode well for our bat populations.
Okay, yep, this is good. So I just threw a couple extra slides in here of other stuff that we've been working on since I have the mic. Dan Bachen and I have talked for a couple of years about reaching out to climbers, and it may not be that necessarily climbers have to engage in the same kind of decon as you guys do because they're working in different environments, but we would love to know where climbers are seeing bats. So so Dan and I put together this postcard modeled on the Colorado program because they are working a lot with their climbers, and it basically is a postcard. There's some on the piano back there, and then there's an 8.5 by 11 information sheet that we put together. At some point, Dan was going to make a more concerted effort to reach out to the climbing community because he's more a part of that community than I am. But if folks are interested in spreading that message in your local climbing organization, take some postcards or some papers back there and let me know if you need anything extra. You can go ahead. 2019 at the Wildlife Society Conference in February in Helena, the Grotto and Big Fork High School were awarded the conservation, just the 2019 Conservation Award. So that was kind of a good deal. Hans came, some of the kids that are here came, and then Ian and Zach and Carl were all representing you guys. So that was a pretty cool deal. The work got a little more press and was, it was appreciated at that meeting. Dan didn't mention it, but was it a BLM and Forest Service award that the Grotto was given also? Yeah. Okay, Zach's saying yes, so that was cool. That happened this year. You can go on, Cody Rose. I want to recognize Zach, who's been a really great partner. He came out on what we can call the trip. So one of my roles lately within the state agency is to work with our congressional delegation to get them to know a little bit more about what sort of wildlife work we do and get them hopefully a little more supportive. So we took Trip McKinney, who is the Natural Resources Director for Congressman Gianforte, into Lewis and Clark Caverns. We saw a little group of bats. We got a nice off-site private tour, and Zach came along on that to help out. And so Trip really enjoyed the trip. I don't know if we ever wrote a trip report, so we should do that. Montana Outdoors. Who saw the Great Falls Tribune article that had the story about Lick Creek Cave? Got one, Ellen. Okay, a few of you. The picture that was up there earlier with Dave Bobbitt and the reporter from the Great Falls Tribune was in the paper, focused on white nose syndrome, cavers, interactions, all that kind of stuff. It was a really nice article. It's going to be reprinted again, kind of in slightly different form, in Montana Outdoors, and I think it's probably coming out in the October-November issue, so you'll see that again. And I'm going to take questions, and I have one more slide. Yeah.
So if you found, let's say, this preliminary survey, you find a bat with white nose syndrome, what do you do at that point?
So that's the trick. I mean, that's a hard question because we don't have a lot to do. It's not as if there's been a silver bullet developed where you would, rush out to that cave and take this action in order to conserve the rest of the bats in the area. We have a whole phone tree, believe it or not, in our response guideline. Colorado is on there as, call number 4 or whatever. But basically, we start a discussion similar to what we've been having is what should we do now? Some of it will go, I keep looking for Dan Siefert. Amy's over there. Dan disappeared. There he is. So some of it will go to the land management agency where that cave is. Do you guys want to do something in terms of a temporary closure, any kind of closure? And I'm going to speak for Dan and say sometimes it's not Dan's choice at all. Someone from higher up can say, you should do A, B, or C based on what's been done in other places. But we've worked really hard as a group to make sure that when that happens, we're all going to have that discussion together to see if there's any action we want to take. One thing that I guarantee will happen is a bunch of disease ecologist people will contact us and say, we want to come do A, B, or C. But again, we have a pretty good, tight little group here and we'll make those decisions together. But often in a new detection situation, like newly detected in Montana, people will want to come do one thing or another. We want to sample bats in other areas. We want to, try out whatever. But we would likely increase our surveillance a little bit in an immediate area to see how prevalent it is after that first detection. Yeah.
So, who would be the first person to deal with it? Would it be the Parks or not? Would it be Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, or would it be the Forest Service?
Well, I get the sample results back, so it's going to be me. So we submit the samples as the Wildlife Management Agency, and then the National Wildlife Health Lab would contact us. But again, then I immediately call Bryce, and I call Ian, and I call folks. So when the South Dakota detection, so I thought I was getting some sort of top secret email, like it's been detected in South Dakota, which I got from my counterpart there. I called Ian and he said, bet I know why you're calling. So he already knew. But we kind of just start spreading that information among ourselves. We did have a close call or so we thought this past winter. The survey crew that went into Azure Cave, which did include maybe Carl and Zach, found a bat that was still alive, right? With some white fungal material on its nose. And so we called the National Health Lab in Madison. We said, we want you to expedite this one. I had results back in 24 hours from the time they got it, and it came back negative. So, we didn't sound any alarms at that point, but I started kind of making some phone calls to let people know that something might be going on, and in the end it was negative. Okay, don't click it yet. My next slide is a little, it's only partially correct because I understand there's 2 birthdays in the room. Go ahead and click. Savannah's birthday is today, and Cody Rose's birthday is today. Yay. Yay. Okay. That was caught on a fly rod, let me point out. By Cody Rose. And it's just a super funny picture. So this next presentation is Dan Bachen. So Bryce and I are going to try to tag team this because Dan handed it to me at like 11 o'clock yesterday morning and said, I don't know if we're going to make it. The baby's not sleeping. So this is really to preface, I think, the later discussion that's scheduled today with Hans and the high school club about Lick Creek. And for those of you that went into Lick Creek yesterday, you already know what the situation is there with graffiti and garbage and all that kind of stuff. And so I don't know what's on these slides, so we're just going to play this by ear. Go ahead and click Cody Rose and let's see what pops up. Lick Creek is close by here. Heritage Program has 2 trail cameras, and Dan has presented on that before at this meeting. So he's got one right at the entrance of the cave. If you've been there, you can see it, but then there's also one a little sneakier placement on the trail to the cave. The idea being this group of folks kind of wanted to see what sort of access that cave actually saw, or what sort of use that cave saw. And
thank you for Ellen Whittle for original camera placement.
Oh, good camera placement, Ellen. And I will say, again, I'm sorry, I don't know if this is in here, but they have gotten some really interesting pictures, one of which we use a lot in presentations when we talk about decontamination. There's a picture of a young gentleman walking out from the cave, right, covered in mud, and we ask ourselves, Is he going to go home and decon? Probably not. Is he going to cave somewhere else? Maybe. So we've gotten some interesting stuff. Lots of cool wildlife photos. Lots of mountain lions up there, just a heads up. Go back, Cody Rose. I got to just talk myself through it. Okay, so 2 formal counts is all in Lick Creek. Bryce, I'm looking at you for
There's more than that.
more than that. Okay, bunch of informal counts, and then I don't know anything about entrance surveys and mist netting.
I don't either.
Okay, go ahead, Ed. We do know it's the 5th largest hibernaculum, so again, we don't have a bunch of big hibernacula in Montana. So 200 bats in a cave for us is pretty big, for those of you from other places. And then these are the species that have been documented in there. Again, most of which are going to be susceptible to white nose syndrome. Go ahead. This is the map. If you all haven't seen this, this is the big giant room. And again, I'm assuming this map, yeah, there's Gabby's name, Carl, Ian, Taylor. So a bunch of folks in this room. Ellen put this map together with Hans. So at least for this discussion later this afternoon, we have a very good geographic reference of what the cave looks like and how big the rooms are and all that sort of jazz. And you go ahead. I wasn't part of this either, but Bryce tells me that this swarming information, so that's bats that are mating and kind of in these giant groups in the fall, this information was collected by acoustic detectors, so that's the, where you can hear the bats basically in this, through this computer system. So we know that these species are found there in the fall as well. Go ahead. So the human disturbance data came from the cameras. I don't think we put a traffic logger in this one. Nope, so this is all just from camera information. Visitation obviously peaks in the summer. For those of you who haven't been there, it's a relatively easy hike in the summer. In the winter, it can be a bit more challenging based on road access. And I think Dan has that in here, that when the road is closed further away from the cave, there's certainly less access because people have to work a little harder. But when the road is open to the trail, it's really, is it a half a mile up? It's not a hard hike at all. A lot of the kids in this room, I think, have done it more than once. So we know that we have visitation during some of these sensitive periods of when bats are just kind of getting settled all the way through to when bats are starting to come out. Go ahead. So yeah, we do consider it kind of a large hibernacula, I guess. We know that we have summer activity as well as year-round activity. I think we've said the rest of that, and then as Bryce pointed out, this one also fits the kind of mold of fungal growth, so it does have the appropriate humidity and temperature inside to support the growth of the fungus. So it's going to take a bat or a visitor with some fungus to bring that in there, and then conditions are right and it could spread in that situation. So this is kind of the discussion for this afternoon, I guess. And it's just that you guys, I would say, have done a really good job of limiting your disturbance to places where we know we have bats, based on what's on the website and word of mouth, among the group, that it's best to stay out of places where there are bats wintering. That's not necessarily the case for other folks or members of the public. So there could be a little bit more done to keep people out of this one. It's probably going to hit the cave. We focus a lot on human-assisted spread of the fungus, but we can't forget that bats can move it around themselves. And he's got white nose syndrome will increase impacts of winter disturbance. So again, white nose is really hard on bats that are trying to just make it through the winter with the reserves that they currently have on board. If they're being disturbed by humans as well, then it's just kind of an additive disaster. Okay, I don't know if there's anything left. Let's see. Nope, okay. Whew. I don't know if Hans or Zach want to say anything about the white nose or the Lick Creek situation?
That's later.
I'm going to save it for later. Okay. Okay.
After dinner.
Any other questions for me on any of this? Yeah.
Can bats at all survive like white nose syndrome?
Yeah, they do have some bats that have shown to survive in the east now. So that was thought originally, it was thought originally that once it came through, it was going to take out everybody. And there's a lot of research right now on looking at those survivors. So if you have a cave where 20,000 bats were found on the ground, and you went back in the next year and there were still bats there that were adults, you assume that they survived somehow that epidemic of disease moving through. So there's a lot of research. We know one thing makes a difference. If a bat goes into hibernation super fat, so super healthy, so another reason to focus on things like, not increasing pesticide use and making sure bats have good food resources, they have a greater likelihood of actually surviving the disease if it comes through. A bat that goes in poor shape, it's just like any other critter in the winter. If you start out in tough shape, you may not make it based on all the other things that might impact you. Okay. Daryl?
Is there any evidence of airborne transmission vectors? Or is it all physical contact to contact?
I don't know.
It's a fungus, so spores go through the air, so it's logical that it would be, yeah. The other thing I would say to your question is, this fungus originally came from Europe, and the bats there have changed their behaviors. They actually wake up a little more often and groom themselves, groom the fungus off. So, yeah.
Juan.
Addressing that, it's assumed that because it's got spores, but maybe the spores on PD aren't as viable airborne as other funguses do. But what I was curious about though is what kind of developments are there in the treatment?
There's all sorts of crazy stuff going on there. I say crazy because they're using drones in some places to spray antifungals inside caves. There's a researcher I just spoke with recently that has been manipulating mine structures to increase airflow or change temperature, and to me that means the bats would probably move. But you can do things within the cave to impact, the growth of the fungus or the ability for the fungus to grow. UV light apparently has some positive impact, but again, all of these things are not silver bullets because they're really hard to do, and any of them that you do might impact the behavior of the bats. And so if you move bats out of an area, I'm not so sure you were successful at doing anything. And then like the UV light thing is really interesting, but how do you deliver it? Do you really want UV lights in a cave? Do you want to hit them with it as they're flying through the entrance? So there's a whole bunch of stuff out there. Those are the ones that come to mind. One cool thing I heard recently is like a dust that you could dust the animals themselves with, and then they'll groom it off and ingest it. So it's like an inoculation that they give themselves. So yeah, go to a white nose syndrome meeting and there's sessions and sessions on people trying to find the magic bullet, but so far, not so much.